Hello and welcome to episode 124 of the Chills of Will podcast. Pleasure today to be joined by Robin Peguero. A little bit about him. He's an Afro-Latino and the son of immigrants who graduated from Harvard College and Harvard Law School. He's written for the Miami Herald, the Harvard Crimson, and the Harvard Law Review, and he served as a press spokesman in the U.S. House and as a speechwriter in the U.S. Senate before becoming a lawyer. He is currently a U.S. House investigative counsel working on domestic terrorism. It is a pleasure to have you. How are you today?
I'm doing quite well. Thank you for having me.
Oh man, such a pleasure, like I said. And so we were just talking about before we started recording that you're like 3 days out and you are in DC right now. I wonder, tell us a little bit about what's coming up this week and how it feels with like the debut novel coming out in 3 days.
Yeah, no, this has been a lifelong dream for me ever since I was a little kid. So it's sort of surreal that it's
Right.
here. It's finally come to fruition. This week, there's going to be a virtual event with Poison Pen on Tuesday,
Okay.
and then an in-person event in Miami at Books and Books, which is a place I've purchased books before, sat there
Yes.
out in the patio and read some books there. So it's kind of again very surreal and able to be there as an author this time and not just as a customer. So
Yeah.
I'm excited about this week.
What was it like? What was like the first time you saw your name on you can see over my right shoulder here, the beautiful book cover, the whole deal. What did it feel like to see your name, big old letters, you know?
Yeah, it was. Well, it sort of takes up a lot of space on the cover, which was not my choice, but
Okay, okay.
it was an interesting aesthetic choice by the publishing company. But it was incredible, if only because also my name is not a very common name,
Hmm.
and so I think it means something to my parents, to my dad. It's
Yeah.
obviously his family name. To have a funny sounding name like mine, sort of on an American book cover, I think it's
Oh,
quite. Indicative of the American dream and how much opportunities we have in this country, and I feel very blessed and lucky to have seen that.
so cool. Going back a little bit, I know. I mean, I've in some of the interviews and in your acknowledgments and stuff, you talk about from age 8, age 10, writing, always having the pen in your hand and having some great mentors and people who passed you along or inspired you as you went along. What was your relationship with language growing up? Did you grow up bilingual? Was it monolingual with some Spanish, peppered in there? How would you describe that?
Yeah, no, my parents emigrated to this country. My mom when she was 24, my father when he was 17, and they met in the U.S. Army, and
Hmm.
and got married. So their first language is Spanish. I grew up hearing them speak Spanish to me as a kid. So I'm native speaker of both English and Spanish. Of
Hmm.
course, going to school and watching American TV, that is my predominant language. English is. But with how I converse with my folks, often it is in Spanish, and so I think that was nice to have that sort of to be bilingual that young, and maybe it had something to do with how much of an interest I took to reading
Hmm.
from a young age.
Hmm. Now, did your parents come from Cuba or Dominican or
Yeah, no, my dad's from the Dominican Republic. My mom is from Ecuador.
from
So
Ecuador?
interesting mix. Yeah.
Right. What growing up in Miami, is that right? Like a suburb of Miami or Miami proper? Or how would you describe it?
Yeah, so I lived up until I was 5 in New York. I was actually born in Providence, Rhode Island.
Oh, okay.
But we moved down to Miami when I was 5, and that's where I grew up. I was there through high school. In particular, it's a city called Hialeah. It's part of
Yeah.
Miami-Dade County, but it's a very working class Cuban American town. So all of my best friends and most of my classmates were Cuban American, and it's a place that's very entrenched in Hispanic culture. When
Yeah.
you go into a store, you're greeted in Spanish first,
Yep.
and so rather than in English. So it was nice to have that sort of sense of uh, home and culture and warmth growing up.
Right. Is there a big Ecuadorian population in Miami and Hialeah?
N-
Right.
no, no, not
No.
particularly.
Okay.
No. And then I feel like a lot of my Dominican side of my family, a lot of them are in Providence, and I do think there's a good community there.
Uh-huh.
But no, there's Cuban Americans, there's Colombian Americans, and
Right.
Venezuelan Americans, mostly in terms of Hispanic population. Not so much representation for Dominicans or Ecuadorians.
Right. 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 Now, Natalie Lima was a classmate, right?
Yes, she was. We went to high school together. Yeah.
Oh, very cool. Doing big things too from the same high school, man.
Yeah, no, she's great, and she's been very supportive. Yeah, no, it's kind of nice. It's a fortuitous that both of us are sort of trying, our paths, our authorial paths, sort of at similar times. But she's amazing and someone I look up to, and
Nice.
quite a good friend.
So cool. So, tell us about growing up and just loving to write. I mean, were you a reader then a writer? Was it concurrent? How, what were you reading as well at that time?
Yeah, I feel like it was pretty concurrent. I was reading I feel like I was reading R.L. Stein and
Sure.
young adult stuff when I was a kid. Some horror, some science fiction, things like that. I also would read whatever my sister was reading. So sometimes I was reading things that were probably for teenagers when I was far too young, because I've looked up to my sister all my life, and so whatever she was doing, I wanted to do. So I would just steal her books and read them. But yeah, at the same time is sort of when I decided, or I just got into writing, and it was always fiction. It was always the idea that I guess you could create something, you could have
Mm,
control over your life. Maybe, childhood angst, you don't have a lot of control over your life, but when you write, you can sort of create a world and have it look exactly how you want it to look. And so I think that's what appealed to me. And yeah, no, since young age, it's an odd hobby, I think, but I'm just writing stories. It's always what interested me.
do those stories still exist? Are they like in a closet somewhere, like those early ones?
They might. I'm sure they're like in some spiral notebooks in my parents' garage or something.
Okay.
Yeah, they're tucked away somewhere. I'm sure I could find them.
But so remind me of your publishing companies. Is it Grand Central?
That's right. So it's a Shep
Okay.
Books, but then the imprint is Grand Central. Yeah.
So you're sure they're not planning on releasing your earlier stuff?
Oh,
You
I would
know?
hope not. I'd be
Okay.
mortified.
All right.
Yeah.
As you got into high school, college, what were you reading? And what kind of made you decide? I guess what were some of the eureka moments or moment where it was like, whoa, I can do what these my heroes are doing. People were telling you this is good work, this inspires me, this is a mirror for me, this is a window for me. So I guess just the reading and the writing as you get into high school and college, where that took you and how you said, whoa, this is maybe something I want to do for a living, maybe down the road.
Yeah. So I mean, I feel like my biggest influences in high school, with literature, were Gabriel Garcia Marquez.
Nice.
Really into magical realism and how sort of baroque and flowery his writing is. Really, really big fan.
Man.
And then also Faulkner. I liked
Mm.
Faulkner. I think I still say my favorite book is The Sound of the Fury.
Oof.
One of the hardest sort of to get through.
Woo.
But I kind of you feel satisfied at the end of it when you get
Mm.
through it. It feels like uh, work, but in the best possible way. Um, so I don't know if that's what that says about my personality, but I really enjoy the way he sort of makes the reader work for it and like put
Mm.
together linkages that aren't always apparent or easy to get at first glance. So those were sort of my literary kind of inspirations. Um, in terms of high school, I was on the paper,
Mm.
and so early on, I just gravitated towards writing. I think the first moment where it felt sort of real was my personal statement probably for college,
Oh yeah.
where I was passing it around to my sister, to other people to look at, and people were giving me compliments on it, and it just came so naturally. At that point, I started to realize that I could write,
Mm.
and I realized that other people didn't enjoy it as much as I did. That was when I think I first realized that potentially I had some talent in that way. People really don't like writing, and I think it is one of
Uh,
those things that it's rare for someone to really enjoy the writing or even enjoy the
mm.
writing process. Even now,
Mm.
people
Yeah.
ask me, how can you, with a full-time day job, write? Like, how do you find the time and how do you find the motivation? And it's because it's a hobby for me. It's fun. Like,
Oh
that's what I do
yeah.
on the weekends for fun.
Right.
And so I think realizing that that was sort of odd is what made me think, okay, well, if that comes naturally to me, if that's something that's fun for me,
Uh-huh.
then they always tell you, try to do what you love for work, as your job, as your career. And so I was hoping that one day down the line that would happen, and I'm glad it's finally coming true.
Huh. So cool. So you see it as a relief or a therapy or a release, like at the end of the day. That's cool.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, it helps me clear my mind, organize my thoughts. I get excited as much as
Mm.
as if I were reading a book while I'm writing it. So my personal essay for college was about the sort of pain I felt, the sadness I felt when I had to kill off characters in
Oof.
my novels.
Oof.
How that made me feel sort of like my my moral sensibilities were
Uh,
heightened or peaked
mhm.
when that happened. And it's because I take it personally. I really enjoy the writing the story. It's fun for me. It's a ride for me. I get excited about the prospect of turns and twists and
Mm.
maybe shocking people or that sort of feeling. I think is what keeps me doing it, even if it's late night or on the weekend. Even if I'm not getting paid for it at the time, it still
Sure.
motivates me.
Oh, that's cool. Back to Faulkner. I'll give you major props. Can you pronounce the name of the county that he creates?
Oh no, I don't know.
Okay,
I don't recall anymore.
why Yoko? Some yeah. It's he really does create his own world, right? But
Right.
yeah, we read that senior year in high school, and our professor. I mean, absolute beautiful human being and great teacher, but we're just breaking our heads against it, right? And he goes at the end, he goes, well, it's really Faulkner said it was really just about a little girl who fell and like ripped her skirt or something like that, or got her skirt dirty. It's like, no, what? No,
Right.
was that simple, really? What were you more into Marquez's like his stories or his books or all the above?
Yeah, so my favorite is Chronicle of a Death Foretold,
Mm-hmm.
Crónica de una Muerte Anunciada. I just really, it was very journalistic the way it was written. And at the time, obviously,
Yeah.
I was interested in journalism, doing it for school. And then I also thought that would maybe be a career for me after college. And so
Mm.
I really liked that way he told it. 100 Years of Solitude, obviously, I'm a big
Mm.
fan. Sort of love the sort of family saga. I loved how long and sort of involved it was.
Right.
So yeah, no, his works have always been an inspiration to me.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. As so there was something I was reading in one of the interviews. I think one of your like one of or multiple birthday parties were like you invited people to like make a story or something. Tell me about that.
Yeah. So as a kid, I would write scripts, screenplays, I guess. Usually horror is what they were.
Ooh.
And then I would have force my friends at my birthday parties to act them out, and we'd record them. So I did that for a couple of years as a teenager. I think they enjoyed it, but it was mostly for me, I think. Um, yeah, my good friend growing up in high school, I would write chapters of stories for her. I would send them to her every week, and she was sort of my first, I guess, beta reader.
Mhm.
And she it was about my group of friends. So the characters were ourselves,
Okay.
and again, it was just a way to kind of create situations, new situations in a world, a sort of different dimension with the same people, but completely
Hmm.
different things happening in their lives. And so again, the joy, sort of excitement, she would tear through it, the chapter. She was always looking forward to it. That sort of feeling was, I guess, what made me realize this is something that I wanted to do on a grander scale. And so, yeah, I've always kind of involved my friends in my writing
Cool.
process.
It's almost like fan fiction about yourself.
Yeah, it was.
Oh,
It's a little odd, but it was a fun time.
cool. So I'd love to know, like, how you got like the first jobs you got into. I mean, did you go to law school right away? And then, how you've balanced writing and the different positions you've held.
Yeah. So right out of school, college, I moved down to DC, and I was there for 4 years, working on the Hill for
Wow.
first Charlie Rangel from New York, and then Amy
Yeah.
Klobuchar. Yeah, he's great.
Oh, nice.
He is a wonderful man, and I'm very grateful to him for giving my first shot. 21-year-old kid right out of school,
Hmm.
and so that was an amazing opportunity and experience. And then I moved over to the Senate side, and I worked for Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota. And during that time, I wasn't quite sure if I was going to go to law school. My sister is a lawyer. She went to law
Hmm.
school, and she was at that time had already graduated. And so I was sort of seeing her. She went into big law, they call it.
Hmm.
Really long hours, good compensation, but
Hmm.
you're overworked, and I saw that, and I knew that that wasn't what I wanted. I knew it wasn't likely going to go down the private firm route, and that if I did become a lawyer, it would be in the same industry business that I was doing on the Hill, which is government work, public interest,
Okay.
serving my community, that sort of thing. And I did realize while I was on the Hill that while I do think government is a force for good, can do a lot of good in people's lives, that it was very slow moving. At the time, it was Obamacare that was being debated and thankfully ultimately passed, but it took over a year, a lot of time to have that signature piece of legislation come to fruition, come to law. And then it sort of had used up a lot of the administration's political capital. And so really administrations get one big thing they get to do, and that's it. And while I do think it was quite a beneficial piece of legislation, I kind of also wanted to feel more the fruits of my labor in real time. So a day-to-day sort of satisfaction, as opposed to sort of slow moving and being one piece and a huge cog. I kind of wanted to interact myself and help people on a person-to-person level. So that's why I decided to go to law school. And while I was in law school, I was the president of Harvard Defenders, which is indigent defense organization there. Because I think as a progressive person, I was more naturally inclined to do defense work. But it was through those 3 years where I realized and learned about how our system, so much of the power is held in the prosecutor's hands. And too many people who, are sort of, they self-select, right? There are certain types who go do defense work, and there are certain types that go do prosecution. I felt like having my outlook, my perspective on the prosecution side might do me better, might be better for the system, and on the margins might be better, helpful. I believe in the criminal justice system. I want it also to reflect the diversity of the community it serves. And so that was why I decided to become a prosecutor after law school. And throughout it, I kept writing. Again, it wasn't really with any thought necessarily of turning it into a career. I just always did it on the side. And so those years being a prosecutor, I thought, well, I have a story to tell about this. And so that's where the idea for this book came about.
Wow. How long ago did you start the book, or is that impossible to say because it was just bits and pieces over the years?
No, yeah, I started, I believe it was 2017, because I had written something about my mother. It's sort of magical realist, and I finished that, I remember, in 2016. So I know that my next sort of project was this book. And I little by little I wrote it, and really during the pandemic, so 2020, the first month, the court system shut down. I was pretty much, I was working. We had arraignments virtually, but that took, for those first 3 months, it took maybe like 10 to 15 minutes in the morning, and otherwise there wasn't a lot of work to do. So it gave me an opportunity to just finish the book, and I did within a month of the pandemic, so 2020. So about 3 years it took, little by little.
Wow. Well, thanks for a short title.
Yeah.
I love long titles too, but man, it seems like in recent years they're just semicolon, or
Right.
colon this, and like so many subtitles, and like, man, I wonder if you can maybe give like an elevator pitch or like a summary of the book.
Sure. I think it's hard, but
if it's too hard, we can talk through it. But
no, I'll try. So I think ultimately the point of the book, the theme of the book, is the most important actor in the criminal justice system is the jury. And I think they get short shrift in literature, in multimedia. I think, we focus a lot on a defense attorney or a prosecutor, potentially a judge, certainly maybe the defendant and the victim. But it matters who the jury is. But like I said, they're usually nameless, they're usually faceless. We don't get to know a lot about them. But that is all that matters, I've learned as a prosecutor. All that matters really is who these people are, where they come from, how they're viewing the facts, through which lenses, because that ultimately dictates the verdict, more so than the actual facts. It's hard to really believe that there is such a thing as an objective fact when people put their own spin on things. I like to always use the example of the Rodney King beatings, right? That was on tape, and yet people will look at the same footage and see different things. And so it matters who's the one seeing it and who's the one making the decision. And so I think that's the point of the book. It is about looking into jurors, their past, seeing how that influences their positions, the verdict. And it's about a case where, a tough case for a prosecutor, a circumstantial case for a prosecutor, one in which, no body was found, no weapon was found, and there are no real direct eyewitnesses to the murder itself. And so it's about these two very strong personalities, defense attorney and the prosecutor, battling it out in the courtroom, and then the jurors and how they're receiving that information. So that's how I would characterize the book.
Nicely done. You've done this before, I can tell. Yeah. So the title significance, I guess you kind of talked about it a little bit, the idea of with prejudice. We often think about it the other way around, right? The jury, that everyone is supposed to deal or supposed to act without prejudice. Is that, you found it over years, that's just not possible? That's just against human nature?
I think the juries try the best they can, and I do appreciate the system for trying to find the most impartial people that you can. I think the issue is that people are necessarily going to have biases, and they're going to, even subconsciously, see the facts through lenses which are tainted, are biased, are prejudiced in some way. And so I think, yes, that's the sort of point of the title. There obviously is the legal term with prejudice. It means when things are final. And for me, the interesting part of the jury is they can arrive at their decision, as long as it's an acquittal, really any way they so choose. You can't arrive at a guilty verdict through improper means. That is overturnable. But if you want to completely throw out the law, and it's called jury nullification, and as prosecutors, you deal with it all the time. You got to try to make the jury care about a guilty verdict, or feel so constrained by the law that even if they want to nullify, they realize they shouldn't, they can't, because the law tells them not to. You have to sort of on the front end try to convince them of that, but on the back end, there's no one there in that room to tell them how they're supposed to decide. They have the jury instructions, but they're human beings.
Sure.
And they can arrive sort of at that decision because it's final. Not guilty is done with prejudice. There is no overturning it. There's no changing it. Once it's in the books, for whatever reason, it's done. And because of double jeopardy, the person can never be tried for that crime again. And so there's both that legal meaning, but then, of course, the idea that, yeah, we all have prejudices, good ones, bad ones, things that have just shaped the way we are. The title is not necessarily meant to be a negative connotation. We all have experiences, and actually, that's part of the law too. We say, use your past experiences, use your common sense. If how long it takes to cross the street, so on and so forth. Like you can build that into your thought process. So you don't have to leave your common sense at the door. We like to say you're still a human being.
Sure.
But I do think we try to pretend that it's objective. It's straight facts when, different juries definitely come to different conclusions with the same facts. And a lot of us trial lawyers, once we pick a jury, we can feel it. I've known, after picking a jury, this is likely going to be a guilty verdict. I just felt it by the type of personalities who were on the jury. And I've had very, very strong cases that I think really, it's really unlikely to believe that anything but what we're telling them happened. It's very strong case, very much, confessions, video, DNA, that sort of thing. And people leave, but they're not guilty. And it happens. And you don't quite know why, but it's a matter sometimes of who they are, what they've experienced as to why they arrive at their verdicts.
With talking about, it's probably too strong to say it's arbitrary, but talking about the fairly arbitrary nature, like you said, it's all relative. It all depends on who's on the jury, who makes up the jury, their experiences. Has that made you has that shaken your faith in the justice system, or is something that you just understand as kind of just the way it is, and you need to work within those constraints, or those, I don't know if constraints is even the word.
Yeah, no, I mean, at least my objective with the book was not necessarily to be critical. It was more to just unveil, I think first people need to know what it is before it can be improved upon. And I do think, of course, the criminal justice system, needs to be improved. I do think there are problems with it that need fixing. I do think, there are certain communities that are disproportionately affected, punishments that are doled out that, again, can be more severe depending on who the defendant is, or actually who the victim is. An interesting fact that I grew up hearing, or I've learned through my studies, is that people used to think that the race of the defendant mattered quite a bit in terms of who was being given the death penalty and who was not. And actually, they found that the more interesting variable, or the more controlling variable, was the race of the victim. People valued the loss of white lives more, regardless of the race of the defendant. Could be a white defendant, but the white victim is what sort of made the imposition of the death penalty more likely versus a black victim. Again, not relative to the race of the defendant, because there was a less of a value on black lives. So no, there are a lot of issues, there are a lot of problems, but it hasn't. I don't know that my faith has been shaken. I do believe in the criminal justice system. Ultimately, I don't think I could have become a prosecutor if I thought the whole system was a farce and needed to be burned down. I believe in changing it from the inside. I believe in improving upon it, and I do think it's difficult. There's a lot of good stuff about having a jury of your fellow peers, of human beings. It's very almost democratic. It's very egalitarian. Unfortunately, also our juries are not very diverse, because there are certain viewpoints. A lot of African Americans are against the death penalty. So what ends up happening is, if you're death qualifying a jury, you're going to kick off a lot of black jurors, and that's problematic, because those jurors also sit in judgment for the guilt phase as well as the sentencing phase. And so you're going to get a lot less diverse jury on capital cases, in which a lot of the defendants are disproportionately black. So there are issues. There are ways, I think, that we can improve upon it. But I wanted to kind of show people what it's like, and how much it's dictated by human flaws, human beings. We can't always control what our feelings are and our subconscious biases. And so there's a conversation to be had, whether we do want, the alternative is maybe judges, imposing guilt or innocence. But again, that's very elitist. These are very highly educated. They come from a certain background, whereas jurors are from everywhere. And I actually really enjoyed that prospect, that idea of meeting the jurors where they are. A lot of my colleagues sometimes would get frustrated or upset at a not guilty and say, oh, well, they're, speak disparaging about the jury. They didn't get it. They're dumb, so on and so forth. I never felt that way, because my job was to meet them wherever they are. It was a failing. If I didn't get the not guilty, I was the one who didn't communicate, articulate well enough, convince them, persuade them enough. It wasn't a failing of theirs necessarily. So, but that's what you get. That's what you get, a system that's, jurors are making the decision, human beings are making the decision. It's going to be necessarily flawed.
Right. One of the things that makes this book so great, and I mean, first of all, just kind of backing up, congratulations. Like, you talked about it. It's out there. It's coming out in a couple of days, and what a read. What an incredible read. And one of the things that makes it so great, I think, is that you don't deal in absolutes. It's not, this is evil, this is purity, this, it's not. I mean, it's realistic to our world. And so you set up Sandy as the prosecutor, right? As the lead prosecutor. And she, I would think she would dub herself to be progressive for sure, but she's also very honest, or I don't know, upfront or blunt about, kind of taking advantage of some of the things like you talked about, right? Like ways to get rid of certain people on the jury, or have them on the jury, and then, without giving away the ending, and I'm gonna tiptoe through that very much, because the ending is, a lot of cool twists and whoa and all that. But you do end with her, and I'm not giving away anything here necessarily, but just kind of like grappling with that, as she does throughout the book. But at the same time, right, you set her up that she's a woman in a mostly male dominated, profession. And so she moves quickly. She's been taught by her dad, who was a legendary one himself in the profession. I wonder about the character of Sandy. You really create some very memorable characters. I wonder where kind of where she came from?
Yeah, I mean, I think she's archetype of someone I've seen in the legal profession. You know, that is unfortunately male dominated, and I have had the pleasure of working under having supervisors of very strong women attorneys, and that's sort of my nod to them. I thought she's just a very powerful woman who is ambitious and sort of type A. Uh, I again also at Harvard, I came across a lot of this character, this type of person, and I thought that was good. I think she's very sharp. I think shrewd, and so I do think that the system is a game a little bit. Jury picking is definitely a game, and you have to be strategic about it. And they're human beings, but you're sort of judging them.
Yes.
Thankfully, in Florida, we have quite a long time with voir dire. You basically get to spend 3 or 4 hours with the jury, and I appreciate that. There are, I did a trial in Massachusetts, my first one when I was at a DA's office there, my 3L year, in which there's like a jury questionnaire and there is no voir dire, so you're just kind of looking at people. And I think those are the most dangerous systems, because that's where I think there's a lot of prejudice that can come in, because you're summing up people by the way they look, and that of course is, it sort of alludes to it. It's called the Batson challenge in the book, about you're obviously not supposed to strike people based on race or gender. But you are still summing up people. You're still trying to basically decide what type of person they are. And as a progressive prosecutor, it's sometimes you're looking for people who wouldn't naturally agree with you. They're probably not going to vote the same way that you are. It depends. Certainly if the crime is one that us progressives tend to think are sort of under enforced. So maybe certainly sexual assault or crimes against women, domestic violence, that sort of thing, then you might want a more liberal jury. But tend to be more judgmental. They tend to respect authority. And of course, as a prosecutor, you're representing the state of Florida, you're representing authority, you're representing law enforcement in a certain capacity. And so sometimes you're sort of at odds. You're sort of there's a conflict there. But I think Sandy goes through that, right? There's the defense attorney sort of calls her out. You think you're this progressive person, but here you are working day and night to put this person in a cage, she says, right, to imprison this person. And it's something that I face as a prosecutor. It's difficult. It's conflicting to both be a part of the system, but know that the system needs to be improved. And so you try to do your best. You try to seek out justice, dismiss cases when you feel there's something not right, when you can't prove something, but try your best and really try to hold people accountable and responsible when their crimes are particularly heinous, and when there are victims' families who are looking for closure or at least their story, their loved one's story to be told. And so, I think Sandy's a reflection of that.
And then on the other side, you have Jordan and his apprentice, if you will, his helper. I want to say Sophia, I think is her name. Sophia, thank you. And both of them, there were a couple CrossFit jokes in there, they both came from CrossFit. And Jordan's an interesting dude, and very calculating, not necessarily in the negative sense, but I was so interested in him, of course, but also the way that he and Sandy got along or didn't. And I've always been so interested in that, this idea that you can go at it in the courtroom, right? I mean, you can, judge, strike that. That's horrific. How could she be saying this? How could he be saying this? And then, afterwards you're like, oh, hey, good job on that. Or I just wonder what you experience with collegiality or lack thereof between, a prosecutor and a defense attorney.
Sure. It's an adversarial system. And that was something that I didn't take to too much, because you're arguing, it's combative at times. And, I did my best not to take it personally, but you're dealing with personalities who very much may take it personally. And especially, and then so much of politics is ingrained in it. So defense attorneys will sort of appeal to you and your politics and your sensibilities, and you sort of sometimes feel like you're being called out personally, because you're not, dismissing this case or giving their client the deal that you don't think merits, that is commensurate with the crime that they've committed. So it can be really draining. It can be really emotionally taxing. I've dealt with my unfortunately fair share of really, bully defense attorneys who have like physically been threatening in the courtroom, who demean me in on the record. And that wasn't pleasant. But I am grateful for those defense attorneys who realized it was a job, that it was we were meant to be professional, and we're able to see a distinction between what we did in the courtroom and what we do outside of it, in terms of just talking with one another and realizing that we both had a job to do, and we were both trying to end up at justice. But they have a very different objective. They have very different interests. Their interest it should be to get the very best outcome for their client, regardless of whether he or she did it, regardless of whether it's what's best for the community, regardless if they themselves feel this person has a high risk of doing the exact same thing, hurting children, hurting the elderly, whatever it is, the crime that they are accused of committing. And that can be difficult. So that there's also that sort of conflict that I think Jordan undergoes, or you see some of that by the end. But sometimes, it can be very personal. It can be very emotional. It can be very dramatic. And so I think I like to say I'm a recovering homicide prosecutor, and I think it's because I needed some time away from that sort of adversarial, conflict-ridden, everyday sort of battling.
Right. You do such a great job with balancing legalese and so you don't have to be a lawyer necessarily to understand what's going on. I wonder how you work with dialogue. Which, again, the dialogue is snappy. It's. I mean, I kind of stopped a few times. I was like, whoa, this has been a whole page and a half or 2 pages of just boom, 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 boom. None of she said, he said, because it often it's usually on the stand. But the dialogue to me seems so realistic and snappy and clever and funny, but not like overly so. How did you deal with like the dialogue, and also, which I guess is related to the jargon or the legalese, and keeping that for those the secular ones, if you will?
Yeah. Well, no, thank you for the compliments. Yeah, I've written out a lot of directs and crosses before, so I think I kind of have that experience. I have that, so that was, I was able to translate that into the narrative. The sort of back and forth, the sort of sharp crossing of someone. It gets, I think there's a rhythm to it. It's a little bit of an excitement. It sort of picks up your adrenaline. Crossing someone is fun, actually. Again, it's a little adversarial, because obviously by nature it's crossing. You're sort of trying to reveal the person on the stand to be either a liar or a exaggerator, that sort of thing. But there's a rhythm and a that I wanted to have reflected in the book, and so I'm glad that came across. Legalese. You don't want. You want to be realistic, right? You don't want lawyers to read it and think, because I've been annoyed myself watching or reading, things in the courtroom and saying that's why is that person talking? They're having this soliloquy in the middle of the courtroom. That doesn't happen. The judge should be shutting that down. I wanted it to be realistic and legal and truthful to my experience, but also obviously not have non-lawyers sort of glaze over, and because that can be boring. But a lot of the lies is dramatic, especially criminal law. It was very, very fun. And even the sort of the strategy, the legal sort of maneuvering, that's a lot of fun to me. So I hope I was able to straddle that line so that it wasn't too in the weeds. But maybe people learned and picked up a couple of things about the law that they didn't know, the inside baseball,
Yes. Darn it, you just talked about. Oh yeah, so that was a question I wanted to ask you too. Is you talk about watching things and saying, this isn't realistic, that wouldn't happen. Have you, I mean, are there TV shows, Law and Order? Are there movies? Are there, books that you really feel like did get it right, or did like, you don't have to say that didn't, but do you feel like, man, I got it right?
Oh yeah, I have a couple of I think Defending Jacob was one that I watched. I didn't read first, but I watched it
Okay.
and I thought it did a good job. I thought that was pretty realistic.
Hmm.
Um, there was an HBO one that I didn't find too realistic, but I can't recall the name, so that's probably for better
There you
for
go.
better.
Right.
And like I think there is such a thing as artistic licenses. I'm not like
Sure.
super critical to the point. We use Law and Order in our jury picking all the time. I think because
Mm.
we're worried that, or CSI mostly, we're worried people are going to think, that our technology has advanced to the point that if you're not bringing in, this high tech, DNA on everything, sort of, the killer was captured in the eye
Right, right,
of
right, right.
the
The
that was
Google
being,
Glass or something.
yeah, something high tech and ridiculous. That they're gonna say the state didn't bring enough evidence.
Mm.
Whereas I like to remind them, how did people convict 200 years ago? There was no DNA, there's no cameras. It's citizens. People, witnesses saw things, and you decide, is that person credible? Are they telling the truth? Do they have a motivation to lie?
Hmm.
It's funny how much jurors think there's all this motivation for witnesses to go through 2 or 3 years of depositions. In Florida, we have depositions for every single witness. So they've already told their story multiple times. They're being
Hmm.
subpoenaed. They're taking days off of work. They're sitting up there and being crossed by an attorney who's calling them a liar. None of it is a pleasant experience, and they think, oh,
Mm.
they just got up there for fun. They're lying for no good reason. Obviously, sometimes there are witnesses who are biased, who have motivations to lie. They're either benefiting some way, profiting in some way. But a lot of people are just good Samaritans. It's funny how skeptical I guess human nature is. But
Right. Such an interesting thing where you start off you start off in past tense, and then we go into present tense. There's a lot of flashbacks and flash forwards, and just the way that you deal with the backstories of the jurors, of those prosecuting, is just so interesting. And like, man, and the way that you bring up certain stories at certain times, certain memories at certain times. I wonder how you like kind of the mechanics of writing this. Where did you write it in the same order as it appears in the book, or was it like one thread, boom, 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 done, and then kind of intermix? How did that work?
yeah, well, the choice of when it's past tense and present tense is very intentional.
Hmm.
Sort of the ending, it's supposed to sort of fit with the ending of the book.
Sure.
And but in terms of writing it, I wrote it the way it appears, which
Mm.
I think people think is odd, or at least they wouldn't have expected it. They would expect that sort of with a story that's a little bit patchwork, where there is sort of different threads, hopefully coming together
Mm.
nicely
Oh
at the
yeah.
end.
Oh yeah.
um I that you would that it might be sort of better to conceptually to sort of separate them and write them out differently, but I didn't. And I think because I want to be true to uh I want to go on the journey along with the reader and make sure that I'm being honest, so that when there are twists or so on and so forth, that they feel earned, they're not cheap, and that there isn't either. I throw in a little bit of their Easter eggs, I think,
Sure.
on a reread, as to the ultimate ending. But I think going along with it makes it so that I can realize, what is it the reader needs to know at this point. What is it that they're would be interesting for them to know, as opposed to so that it threads together, as opposed to sort of seeing them as separate.
Hmm. Yeah. So like the very beginning, for example, you have Earl Thomas, who is very awkwardly named the jury foreman. With he calls it a microaggression. It's racist. It's patronizing, and you juxtapose that with him being pulled over and harassed, over his beloved car, right? So that's one of the first like stories that really pulls you in, one of the first backstories. And we get it from Sandy a bit. We get it from remind me, Sterling. Is it Sam
Yep.
Sterling?
Sam Sterling. Yep.
Right. I mean, he has a pretty incredible and sad, background and story. You get a little bit of that with Lee, who's the guy who's I guess opening his day at the bar, not ending it, right? That kind of thing.
Right. Right.
Those are just some of the stories. Dr. Laura Hurtado, and there's so many interesting stories that go throughout. I wonder about, so the main part here is that we have Gabriel Soto, who we don't actually know a lot about, right? Even at the end, towards the end, we get some more about him, but we really don't know a whole lot about him. He is the one who's on trial, right? There was even one point where you wrote it very well, something about how the people in the courtroom even forgot he was there, right? Because of, like you talk about, the storytellers who are the lawyers, the jury, all those, the judge and the motions and this and that. It's like, oh yeah, he's there too. And then is it she goes by Mel, is it Melina?
Yep.
Melina Mora, right? Who's a very, who's sympathetic character in many ways. And she is the one who was killed. We of course feel so much for her family, for her mom. I wonder how much of her, because she was, pretty much everyone admitted she was a carefree, happy, for the most part, trusting person who, had her flings, which of course, there are things like the rape shield, and there are things like, obviously there's an incredible double standard where, a guy is celebrated and congratulated while she's, the name could possibly be put through the mud. I wonder about Melina as a character, or just, I guess, as an archetype, kind of where that came from, this idea that young, beautiful, smart, but also where, they didn't want to attack the character, or they did, kind of where that came into play.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think to your earlier point, the victim and the defendant sort of become wallpaper. It's kind of unfortunate, certainly for both. Obviously, the man, in this case, let's say the man who's being accused and whose liberties at stake. This is all for him. This is the whole show. Is we're here because of him, and that he's going to face the consequences. And yet, it sort of feels like a show, and it feels like he's not really a main character because he isn't speaking usually. Very often doesn't testify. The defendant usually invokes their right to silence against self-incrimination. And so, as a prosecutor, sometimes you need to remind people. You need to remind people, like, I need you to remember the bad thing he did, because we're sort of, talking about the law, talking about it becomes a game. Who's
Sure.
winning what objections? Oh, the judge is really sustaining that person's objections, this, that, and the other, where it's really should be about this, society healing from, the process, I think, of the trial is more important than really the results. It's about having this moment where we're getting the truth out, where we're deciding what happened, and we're saying, okay, that was wrong. I think there's an expressive function to the law that's really important that sometimes gets lost in the gamemanship a little bit. Same thing with the victim, and that's more by design. You're not supposed to get up there and try to evoke so much sympathy for her. You can't really talk too much about what, she's done in her past, and good things, trying to, paint a portrait of her and what was lost to the family, because that might be prejudicial. It's supposed to be about the facts, not necessarily about how good of a person she was or how much of a loss it meant to the family. Like, that's not supposed to be the reason you convict somebody. So she also kind of fades into the background, and unfortunately, we forget the victim who was treated in that way. So Melina, for me, just came from having that experience, particularly, when the last 3 years in which I was the homicide prosecutor, the sort of pain that the family feels and how little they hear about their person that they're there trying to vindicate throughout the trial. And so I wanted, I've had that sort of victim before, young, one of my most serious cases was a young woman who was brutally raped and then beaten to death by a young man. And I think I thought of her a lot while writing this, because I wanted certainly to show that, a sympathetic victim, really, I think we should be sympathetic to anybody who loses their life. And I think that's what was concerning to me sometimes as a prosecutor, is that sometimes you do have victims who they were either angry or maybe didn't have the best reputation, maybe weren't, of the socioeconomic status of a lot of the members of the jury, whatever it is,
Mm-hmm.
you still want people to realize that no one is deserving of death. Uh, but yeah, I wanted to showcase that often defense attorneys, I think because a lot of what I read lionizes defense attorneys, and I think
Mm-hmm.
their job is incredible. It's a noble profession, and as I said, I more naturally was inclined to do defense work before I decided to become a prosecutor.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that there's conflict there. Sometimes you have to beat up on a dead victim. Sometimes you have to
Mm-hmm.
call them names in the courtroom. In essence, you have to stress the parts of them that maybe, again, go against your sensibilities, maybe you think is kind of horrific to
Mm-hmm.
do, but that's in the best interest of your client. And so I wanted to show that. I wanted to show that there are sort of, just as there are seedy, sort of maybe unpleasant parts of being a prosecutor, it's the same on the defense side. Really, in the criminal justice system, unfortunately, nobody really has clean hands. Really, it's a
Mm.
little bit of a tragic sort of all around. Everybody's sort of dealing in tragedy, basically.
Right.
Um, so I wanted to, through the victim, show that some of the tactics of the defense can be sort of morally repugnant. And we're all trying to reach this ultimate good, this ultimate truth, but there's a lot of ugliness in the criminal justice system.
Mm. Yeah. Again, what you do so well in the book is you don't just give a voice, you give so many voices, right? You give voices to people, you give their background, which helps us to know their motivations. And there's something about, you give one and a half, I get, or two, I guess two flashbacks of Melina, one not long before she was killed, and then one, maybe I guess 10 years earlier. But to know her, to see her dialogue is that, she's not just a nameless, faceless victim. She was, she's a full-fledged human being. So that seems obvious, but extremely well done. And again, man, don't want to give away too much of the ending, or the book as a whole, but just so many interesting characters, the twists and turns, the drama is clearly there. The ending, you may think it's an ending and it's not quite the ending, just keeps you going. And at the end, you're just like, wow, this is a writer who has really captured something, has really captured the zeitgeist. So a huge congratulations to you on this one.
Thank you so much. I appreciate all the kind words.
Man,
I'm glad you. That's what I was trying to do. So I'm glad you picked up on it.
and I'm just a dude in my little, bedroom/office here saying this. You've gotten some great blurbs from, help me with the pronunciation. Is it Harlan Coben?
Yeah, Harlan Coben and Scott Turow.
Yeah. Someone like me who doesn't necessarily read in that genre all the time, but I mean, I for sure, as a layman, know those names. With publishing, I know that genre does matter, or can matter. Is this going to be marketed as a thriller, as a legal thriller? How does that work?
Yeah, all of the above. I like to think that it's also a little bit of literary fiction. It's
Yeah.
kind of like a mix, because I do think hopefully it makes you think. And there's a lot of, it's character driven. I think there's a plot, certainly, so I think I tried to balance those two so that we sort of get a nice picture of people and atmospherics while also moving forward the plot. But yeah, no, it's legal thriller, a thriller, all of the above.
Mm-hmm. Is there a sequel in the works, or I'd love to know? I know you're like, oh man, I'm just getting this dang book out, but I'd love to know, just not necessarily about sequel, but any future projects you're working on.
Yeah, so I'm interested in sort of picking up a character and sort of having a different story. So it wouldn't be a sequel, but
Mm-hmm.
my someone from this book that's sort of familiar as maybe even a minor character in the second one. I'm working now on sort of like a political thriller set in DC on the Hill, given my experience there. So I'm excited about that potentially. I just want to keep writing things I think that are hopefully thrilling, exciting, dramatic, but also look at our society, whether it's race, gender, all the sorts of complex, debates and cultural issues that we face, and really says something about them, really reveals something about them, because they're obviously foremost on the minds of people, and on my mind, having lived as a minority in America. I think that they're important issues to talk about. I think most interesting to me is how white people view race. I think that often when we're talking about race, we'll talk about the perspective from the person facing either the microaggression or the minority. But I think that there's so much interest in seeing how the dominant group, how they respond to race, how they respond to their own race, because whiteness is a race, and so sometimes we see it as the default, and race is only sort of in opposition to whiteness. But I think that they're both merit study, and so I think those sorts of issues are ones that are always kind of foremost in my mind, and hopefully will be reflected in my writing. But I also, again, want to make sure it's entertaining, want to make sure it's fun, want to make sure people both think but then feel a sense of satisfaction. So that's what I'm hoping to write next.
Yeah, so many believable characters, so many interesting characters. I could see a book for, character A, character B. Run me the name of the one who kind of like became like a self-styled like vigilante on the jury.
Oh yes, Joseph Cole.
Yes, I mean, I was laughing, but also cringing, and also just, he was just from a writing point of view, did a great job with the character. Even his wife was like, "Oh God," with this
Yeah.
guy. But he was also, he's also reminded me of like a George Zimmerman or something, right?
Right.
Where it's just like, okay, this is, these microaggressions, if you will, become full-fledged racist, violent, the whole deal. So there were some characters that were so many characters in here, just like, wow, did a great job really shaping them. Again, I want to thank you, and man, have fun with all the promotions and all the stuff as you get into it this week. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. I'll try my best to not be too nervous and to enjoy it all.
Pleasure talking to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
What a pleasure it's been to speak today to Robin Peguero. Continue good luck to him with his writing. So looking forward to following his career. You can now subscribe to the Chills at Will podcast on Apple Podcasts and leave a 5-star review. You can also ask for it by name using Alexa, find it on Stitcher, and on any of your favorite streaming platforms. Follow me on Instagram, where I'm at Chills at Will Podcast, or on Twitter, where I'm at Chills at Will PO1. And pardon me, Robin, please, your social media.
Oh, I think my Instagram is Sir Robin of Luxley. My Twitter should be my last name, Peguero Robin. So
okay, cool. And
there.
Any like favorite bookstores? You mentioned one earlier. Any favorite bookstores where you'll hey, go out and support?
Oh yeah, Books and Books. Like I said, I used to go there all the time. And I'll be appearing there on Friday. So that's always a favorite of mine, a local Coral Gables, Miami establishment.
Okay. Awesome. The People's Republic of Miami, as it's referred to in the book.
That's right. That's right.
I love that. You can watch this and other episodes on YouTube. Watch and subscribe to the Chills at Will podcast channel. Please tune in for episode 125 with Jamil John Kochai, the author of 99 Nights in Logar, which is through Viking, which is a finalist for the PEN Hemingway Award for debut novel and the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature. He was born in an Afghan refugee camp in Peshawar, Pakistan, but he originally hails from Logar, Afghanistan. His short stories and essays have appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Plowshares, and the O. Henry Prize Stories 2018. Currently, he's a Stegner Fellow at Stanford University. He's also, I guess, a fellow Sacramentan, so we'll look forward to talking about that. The episode will air on May 31st. And again, thank you to Robin, and I want to wish all of you listening some happy quarantine reading. Hopefully you find books that thrill you, just like with Prejudice by Robin Peguero. Thank you again for listening. Bye-bye.